Hi everybody, it's Brett Warren here, Director of Metropole. It's a new year, the start of a new year, and also the start of a new property cycle. So with that in mind, there's so many property investors in Australia that probably don't get past their first or second property. I think it's around 70% that own one property and around 92% that own two properties. So with that in mind, with the start of another property cycle, I thought I'd turn the table on Michael Yardney and understand from one of Australia's leading property investors what it takes to create a level of wealth and to create obviously more than one or two properties. So Michael joins me now. How are you going, Michael?
Thanks, Brett. And you're right. In Australia, there are about 2.1 million property investors, but only a tiny percentage, around 20,000 people, own 6 or more investment properties. Isn't that interesting? 1.9 million own 1 or 2, 20,000 own 6 or more. And I know when we were chatting about having this talk, we recognised that there's a disproportionate number of our clients at Metropole who've built very substantial portfolios. So I think it's a great idea to get going in the new year, at a new time, to see what not to do rather than all the talks about what you can do.
Yeah, look, 100%. And I think you've obviously helped and mentored more people than anyone to get into that top 2 or 3%. So what better person to talk to us about the processes and the things that you see that really stand out?
Well, let's go through the first one. The first one is, I think a lot of people treat property investment as a hobby, not as a business. They love property. They love going to open for inspections. They love going to auctions. Well, maybe they don't love going to auctions. They're a bit nervous about auctions, but they love the excitement of buying a property. They love the excitement of renovating. They love the thought of becoming a property mogul. In short, they're having fun, and that's not the way you become rich in property. In my mind, you need to have a business mindset. If you're looking for fun, go bungee jumping, go trail bike riding. Property investment should be boring, but that makes the rest of our lives exciting. So if you treat property investment as a business, you wouldn't think as much about each individual transaction. You'd be looking at the big picture. You'd be looking at the long-term goals, because property investment is actually a process. It's not an event. You're going to have a business plan, which includes cash flow management, a finance strategy, asset protection, insurance, correct asset allocation, and you'd have a good team around you. So that's the first reason, I guess, Brett, that people don't treat it correctly. And if you were to buy the local Glory Jean's coffee shop or a big business in the local street, it wouldn't cost as much as the $700,000, $800,000, $900,000 investment property you're buying, but you would be treating that as a business, wouldn't you?
Look, absolutely. And I think the other thing is, with when you are treating it like a business, you're not caught with the shiny, flashy things like, granny flats and Airbnb and cash flow hotspots and all those kinds of things. So you're committing to a process, and you've got a strategy up front. And funnily enough, that leads us into the second point. People are investing without a strategy.
You're right, Brett. Exactly. So you've got to know where you're heading. So you want to know the end point, but more than that, you actually need the strategy to get you there. And for a lot of people, it's just buying close to home because they know the local area. Or for others, it's they actually move home. They want to move into a bigger home, so they keep their old home as an investment. And they probably bought their first home with emotions for emotional reasons, not with investment criteria. And I know others still today, despite all the news, and only earlier on today, I got a message on Facebook, somebody asking for help and asking about buying off the plan and keeping questioning me. He kept saying, oh, but I didn't think it applies to this and that. He's so desperate to get in the market. He's buying off the plan based on promises from marketers. Others make a mistake by buying, as I said, in their comfort zone. Now, one of the big mistakes that investors then make is they don't have a strategy. And as I said, buying close to home, buying in your own backyard. I remember last year there was a university study, University of New South Wales and Tasmania, two were collaborating, and they looked at where people bought and found that 2/3 of investors bought close to where they live because it was convenient. But interestingly, it showed that they didn't have a hometown advantage. They weren't buying better value for it. In fact, they were usually doing worse for it. You've heard it before, Brett, failing to plan is really planning to fail. On the other hand, strategic investors, they devise a strategy, they bring their future into the present, and they put a plan together to achieve the results they want.
Absolutely. And I guess as part of that strategy, it's probably prudent to get expert advice. You always tell me, Michael, that if you're the smartest person in your team, you're in trouble. So having someone to actually help you implement that strategy is paramount, isn't it?
It is. And the bottom line is not every strategy works. So that's, I guess, another mistake, another reason why property investors fail. They have this wrong strategy. That's almost as bad as having no strategy at all. In my mind, residential real estate is a long-term, high growth, relatively low yield investment. So we at Metropole, our strategy has always been to use the capital growth of your property portfolio to grow a large asset base that in the future will give you choices. Yet many beginning investors chase cash flow. They chase the next hotspot. They try and make a big profit by flipping properties. And in my mind, they're all recipes for disaster. I know others chase tax benefits thinking that negative gearing is going to keep their tax down. So they buy new properties in outer suburbs or high-rise properties because there's depreciation allowance. The problem is a lot of these properties just don't offer the capital growth that you require to grow your wealth. See, the trouble is we don't know what the future is going to be. We don't know whether you can negatively gear in the future or not, whether there's going to be superannuation of pension, what government legislation is going to be. But in the future, when we want to transition to live off our property portfolio, if you've got a big portfolio, if you've got big assets, you'll have choices. If you don't have a big asset base, you won't have choices. In my mind, the only reason to invest in property is to get capital growth. But Brett, how often have you found when we discuss that with clients, it's just too simple for them? They look for something more complicated.
With all the ads out there claiming you can be cash flow free in 3 years, and there's just no patience, is there, Michael?
Well, they also say you can buy 10 properties in 10 minutes and 7 properties in 7 years. It doesn't work that way, not if you want investment grade properties. And I guess that's one of the other mistakes we're going to discuss as we go along, because not every property is an investment grade property. So we talked about not having a strategy. I think another mistake people make is changing their strategy. Now, of course, if you start with the wrong strategy and you change it to the right one, that's the right thing to do. And you and I know that most investors get it wrong for the first 5-10 years of their investment career because they get lulled into a false sense of security by marketers or spruikers, and they make mistakes. So they do change their strategy. But what I see, they've got to correct it because they're not getting anywhere. But unfortunately, I see many investors getting spooked by the market, especially when the market softened. Remember back a year or two ago, how many of our clients wanted to sell up, wanted to change to cash flow? They're looking for what works now rather than what's always worked. I think you should be looking for the long term. And so that's one of the other mistakes, Brett, changing strategy, looking for the hotspot or the shiny toy.
Yeah, great, Michael. And also, as we're getting into the new year, I guess as people are tightening their belts and setting some goals for the new year, cash flow is also an important concern. Look, it's a secondary concern for us. It's cash flow that keeps you in the game. It's capital growth that'll get you out of the game. So can you talk to us a little bit about the cash flow concerns as well?
It's 100% right that you need cash flow to see you through. So when we structure our clients' portfolios and a strategic plan to get them to get to the next level in property, what we do is buy them time. So smart investors don't just buy property, but they buy time to enable them to ride the ups and downs. And that's often done through having cash flow buffers to see them through a rainy day, to see if interest rates go up, can they cope? And I'm not at all suggesting interest rates are going to go up. If there's a vacancy, can they cope? If there are repairs. So cash flow is important, but the cash flow doesn't necessarily have to come from the property. If you set up the right finance structures up front, you can actually buy a couple of years of time by having the right structures, and that'll make a big difference, Brett.
Michael, I know I see a lot of people from Melbourne and Sydney who have bought in secondary locations, and because the market's done so well there in the last decade, they're a bit overconfident. They've got it right the first time, and that can sometimes be to their detriment, can't it?
Definitely. One of the worst things an investor can do is get it right the first time. Show me a booming market and I'm going to show you an investor who puffs out his chest and says, look how good I am, look how smart I am. They falsely believe that the rapid growth of their property has been because they're brilliant rather than simply the result of a rising market. But Brett, little confession, that's exactly what happened to me when I started. I had no idea what I was doing. Labor Party came into power in the early 1970s when I bought my first property. Inflation went up. My property went up. A couple of years later, there was so much equity and the rent had gone up just because inflation had. I was able to go back to the bank and borrow for a second property within a couple of years. And I thought it was because I had the Midas touch. I thought I was really smart. By the way, the market taught me a lesson when it turned around a little bit later on.
It's interesting, isn't it? My first investment, Michael, was in a secondary location, and the mining boom helped things along. And I thought I'd struck gold, but I was crashed down to earth pretty quickly as well. So it's quite common. And one of the things I also find, Michael, is investors are getting into it with unrealistic expectations.
You're right, Brett. Investors fail because they're not patient enough. They've read too many stories about overnight successes. They go into property investment hoping for a quick profit or thinking they can, as I said a moment ago, buy 7 properties in 7 minutes. In reality, property investment is a get-rich-slow process. It takes most investors 20, sometimes 30 years to grow a big enough asset base to provide a cash machine for their retirement. They don't like to hear that. By then, many people have thrown up their hands, they've sold up, it just takes too long. And I guess it's nothing new. It's always been that way, that there's always been get-rich-quick schemes trying to take away your money and stopping you growing wealth the right way. But remember, one of my favourite sayings has always been, you've heard it so often from me, you must be sick of it, Brett, wealth is the transfer of money from the impatient to the patient. So if people ask me, well, what do I have to do? How do I grow a big property portfolio? Brett, my suggestion would be that they go through 5 stages. The first stage is the education stage, learning about property investment. And they do that through listening to podcasts like this, watching a video like this, reading our blogs. And I know regularly you've got little videos and blogs as well. The first stage is learning. Be careful who you're learning from. Make sure that you learn from people who have actually done it and achieved it. The next stage is the saving stage. This is where you spend less than you earn, trap the excess cash flow into a savings account or something, and save up a deposit to invest. The next stage, the third stage of your wealth creation journey, is the accumulation stage. And it usually takes 2 and sometimes 3 property cycles to build a sufficiently large asset base of income producing properties to move to the next stage. So accumulation first, then lowering your loan to value ratio, stage 4, and you do that in a number of ways. And then eventually you can live off your cash machine of your property portfolio. Brett, you've got to do it in the right order. Otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah, some great points, Michael. Someone who has played a big part recently in the property market, especially Dr. Andrew Wilson was saying, was the media. For one reason or another, and for good or bad, they certainly do play a role in pumping up the market, but also deflating the market at times too, don't they?
Very much. So as a forecaster, people like Andrew Wilson and our research department at Metropole can look at statistics and facts and auction clearance rates and supply and demand ratios and wages, etc. But what is really hard to quantify is consumer sentiment. And it's consumer sentiment that drives the market. And as you said a second ago, it really has a lot to do with the 24/7 news cycle now, because the media thrives on headlines and reasonably negative headlines. I know last year Pete Wargent wrote an interesting blog explaining how when he puts a negative blog or a negative headline, because he doesn't write negative things. And when he speaks to my podcast, if we speak about it and we put the right headline, we're going to get 10 times as many readers if they think there's going to be something bad. Anyway, so there's news cycle feeds on that. Having said that, during the booms, when we probably should be most cautious, FOMO, fear of missing out, encourages beginning investors to pay too much. And during the property slump, like we experienced, not in Brisbane where you're based, but more in Melbourne and Sydney, and I know you're based in Brisbane, but you look nationally after our buyers agencies in our 3 big capital cities, during the property slump, when property is available at a discount, there was phobia, not FOMO, fear of buying early, and that stopped people taking advantage of the opportunities. And now they're looking back, Brett, and saying, hey, I should have paid attention to you a year ago.
I think a lot of that data is also in retrospect, isn't it? It's usually 2 or 3 months old, and the market has moved on one way or the other.
Very much so. So our research at Metropole is not just looking at all that historical data. And when we started doing things differently and looking at leading indicators, things that are going to create demand in the market in the future, it totally changed the way we personally are investing, as well as how our clients' successes have been. So we look at data looking forward, such as economic growth, wages growth, population growth, jobs growth, because all those are going to create a demand and a need and an ability where people are going to have higher disposable incomes. So you've got to be careful what you listen to. You're right.
Michael, next we're just recognising the fact that there's not just one market, it's not the market. And if we break it down into states as well, it's not just the Melbourne market or the Brisbane market. I can tell you here in Brisbane, we've only really had about 1% growth in the last 12 months, but many of our clients have received 5 or 6 times that amount in the last 12 months. So recognising that there's not just one market, is there?
You're right, Brett. And the media, though, talks about the Australian property market or the Brisbane property market or Sydney property market. And there are hundreds and hundreds of properties within the market. And when we select a property for our clients after doing a strategy and our buyers agents go out and help them, we're not buying the market. We're buying an individual property in the market that, because we've done the right research and because we've paid the right price, is going to outperform the market. But yes, you're right. Each state's at its own stage in the cycle. And within each state, there are multiple property markets separated by geography, by different price points, by different types of dwelling. So in Brisbane, for example, we've been avoiding the apartment market because of the oversupply, which is working its way down now. But for many years, we haven't been buying apartments in Brisbane, while houses in Brisbane have done well. And then within certain precincts of Brisbane, they've done amazingly well. So that's what we have to look for. So listening to the market commentary in the media isn't helpful.
Very true. We've heard the saying location, location, location. And we always say that 80% does that heavy lifting. So that's what the location will do. Tell us a little bit more about what makes up the location criteria, Michael.
Well, you're right. You can't change the location. So therefore, you've got to get the location right. I've found many investors do it the other way around. They actually find a property they like, and then they do some homework and some research, and then they ask me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, is that the right property? When they've actually done it the wrong way around, they should be choosing the location first. So location does most of the heavy lifting, as you said, but not all locations are equal, and most investors don't recognize that, and that's another big mistake that they make. So many chase growth corridors. In other words, spruikers will say, this is a growth corridor because look at all the new estates happening in the outer suburbs, or, hey, look at all the high-rise towers in the inner city, so there's growth there. But the problem is significant new supply of dwellings that are required to accommodate that huge growth is the reason these areas exhibit poor capital growth. So physical growth is not the same as capital growth, the growth in value of the property. And in my mind, supply, excessive supply, is the enemy of capital growth, or abundant supply, even if it's not excessive, or the ability to add new supply is the enemy of capital growth. Instead, in my mind, a significant driver of capital growth is the strong demand by owner-occupiers who can afford to pay, and a scarcity of a particular type of accommodation. So we look for aspirational areas where people want to live. They wake up in the morning saying, I want to live in those areas, maybe because of a good school zone, maybe because of good amenities, maybe because of good lifestyle. And we like gentrifying suburbs that are changing. Also, public transport is going to become very much more important in this new decade, because all our capital cities are sort of squeaking at the edges a bit. There's now such a large population growth that they're having difficulty fitting everyone in. I know it's a great time then to listen to the Michael Yardney podcast when you sit in your car for a long time, but most people just can't do that every day. What a pity. So you're looking for areas close to good public transport and multiple lifestyle drivers. And we've got to understand that that varies from state to state. And I know you look after our buyers agents teams in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, and you've got very, very different criteria of closeness, proximity to CBD or lifestyle drivers, depending upon where you are.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Brisbane doesn't have the urban sprawl of a Sydney or Melbourne. It doesn't have the huge population growth. So quite often people do get caught out. They think they can buy 15 or 20 kilometres out like they can in Sydney and Melbourne, and they quite often do get caught out.
And it's not concentric circles either, so it's not a round circle. So while you're saying 15, 20 kilometres, in some areas you're prepared to go in Melbourne and Sydney even further, and in other locations in the north and west, in some areas, you may not go out as far. So it's not as simple as drawing a circle from the centre of the CBD, is it?
Look, Michael, I think that's a really important distinction you've just made between physical growth and capital growth, because quite often you can pick up the magazine and see that a certain area might have done 30% growth in the last 12 months or 18 months. And when you look at it on the map, it's in the middle of nowhere, and sheep and cows were living there 12 months ago, but there's been all that physical growth, and you wouldn't necessarily go and buy in that particular area.
Well, it's true that the typical property has increased in value. But it's not the same property that's gone up, because a year or two ago it was vacant land, or it was different, or it was farmland. And so therefore the nature of the property will make a difference as well. So we're really looking for resales. So what we say to create high growth is a location where the locals, the people living there, have higher disposable incomes and are able to and prepared to pay to live there. Now remember, the rich do not like to commute. And so they're going to continuously want to live in these leafy, more established areas, while the poor are going to get flung further and further out to the extremities of our growing cities.
Michael, I see a lot of people with maybe 3, 4 or 5 properties, but they're not all investment grade. So maybe tell us a little bit about that as well.
Well, you're right. Not every location is right. But when you find the right location, we say that only a small percentage of the properties in that location are investment grade. Now, any property can be an investment. You just kick out the landlord, the owner, put a tenant in, and all of a sudden you've got an investment property. But that doesn't make it investment grade. So for me, investment grade is one that outperforms the averages. And you can do that. I can do that. Our teams can do that in property. But I can't do it in shares. And I can do it because property is an imperfect market. I can actually get an advantage by knowing the research, by having on the ground perspective of what's going on, choosing the right locations, and then finding a property that has a number of special attributes. Number one, it has to have owner-occupier appeal. Not that we're selling, but owner-occupiers make the market. Owner-occupiers are the ones that will buy properties similar to yours to push up the value of their properties, pushing up the value of yours. I like to buy in areas where supply is scarce. I like to buy properties with a high land to asset ratio. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have a lot of land, and I've got no issue with townhouses or apartments in Sydney and Melbourne in particular. Apartments are okay. Townhouses are good in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. But I'd rather have a high land to asset ratio, a sixth, a tenth of a apartment building in a great location than acres in regional Australia where there isn't as much scarcity. I like to find a property with a twist, something a bit unique, something a bit special about it. Maybe it's got a bigger courtyard area, maybe it's got 2 balconies, maybe it's got 2 car parks, something that during booms, everything sells. But we've run through a couple of difficult years recently where unless your property was special, because there was a flight to quality, secondary properties dropped in value considerably. So you also want the sort of property when there's a number on the market to rent that the tenants are going to say, hey, yeah, that's actually got a twist. That's got something special. I'll go for that. So we look for a property with a twist. We, in particular, like properties where you can add value through renovations or refurbishment, redevelopment. Also, it's important to buy the property that banks are happy to lend against. So banks don't like unique or different property. So when I said scarce, it doesn't mean that it's something unusual. So you shouldn't have the only pink property in a street of all blue houses. That would stand out and it wouldn't be good. Similarly, banks don't like serviced apartments, small apartments, certain postcodes, large complexes, because even if you can get the finance, you're going to want, even if you're never going to sell, others in that complex or in that area or that location to be able to sell at high values. So if the next buyer can't easily get finance, it's going to lower the growth of your property, make it less attractive. So in some cases, it's company titles or stratum titles, there's special titles, flood-prone areas, things like that. Make sure you buy the sort of property that's attractive to the banks. There's the golden rule, Brett. The person with the gold makes the rules, and the banks have got your money.
That's great, Michael. Thank you very much. Look, we've gone through a lot today. We've talked about the location and gone to a fair bit of detail. We've talked about the actual properties itself. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I think a big mistake people make is trying to do it on their own. Because everyone lives in a property, many novice investors believe that real estate investment is easy. And it's not. We know that most property investors, as you said right at the beginning, never achieve the success they want. But what a lot of people do is they try and go it alone. That's one degree. Or the other side is they fall prey to spruikers or marketers, and soon they're mortgaged to the hilt in a property that's going to struggle to grow in value and not ever going to give them enough leverage to get to the next property. On the other hand, savvy investors take responsibility for their own education. So I'm not saying outsource your education. You should learn by watching videos like this, listening to podcasts like this, but they also understand that they need a team of experts around them to help them succeed. They know that they won't ever know as much as these professionals and realise it's going to take years and many transactions to gain true perspective. And I know we often joke, Brett, that our Brisbane buyers agents team see people fly in from the southern states and they make an offer on a couple of properties and pay more than we ever would because they don't recognise that side of the street or that end of the street is so different to this end of the street. They don't have the perspective, Brett.
Yeah, it's market depth, isn't it, Michael?
It is. And that takes years to learn, and you can't shortcut that. You can't, it's market perspective that money can't buy, but you actually can hire it by getting a team of professionals around you. So I believe that if you want to become financially successful this year and allow property to be part of your wealth creation journey, you should have a chat with the team at Metropole who do more than buy property. You're actually going to need more than the buyer's agent. So in my mind, a buyer's agent, Brett, is, and no disrespect to you because that's where you started, but you've worked your way up from a buyer's agent to a property strategist, now to a director and my business partner, is buyer's agents an order taker. And this, they're critically important. And their on-the-ground depth and knowledge and experience, and all the buyer's agents and ex-estate agents who've worked on the other side and lived and bought in those areas for many, many years, you need a buyer's agent to implement the strategy that a property strategist puts together. So it all starts with the strategy, but you need more than the property strategist. You need more than the buyer's agent. In my mind, you need a holistic view. So you've got to get the right finance, the right ownership structures, and then only buy investment grade properties. So if you're interested in getting to the next level, if you're interested to see how your current portfolio is going, if you'd like a strategic plan that will bring your future forward and give you crystal clear clarity on what you need to do, not just what's likely, but what's realistic. Because sometimes, as we said during this chat a minute ago, your ideas, your plans aren't realistic. Why not have a chat with the team at Metropole, metropole.com.au, or give us a call of 1300 Metropole. And there's no obligation for the first chat. Why not see what having Australia's multi-award winning team would help? Brett, I was really proud at the end of last year, we won another award, and it was an internationally recognised award from International Finance magazine saying we were the #1 property consultants in Australia. So another string to our bow. It's lovely to get that recognition. That's not what we're in it for, but it's nice when it happens.
Look, especially internationally, Michael, you know, we're a national business, but to be recognised internationally is even better. Thank you very much for your time today, Michael. There's some valuable lessons there. And I think while some people may make the mistake of, you know, wanting to own so many properties, 5, 6 properties or whatever it may be, I think what we've learnt today, and especially in this time and age, is actually quality over quantity and actually getting the right size asset base and the right number of assets in your property rather than just chasing the number of properties along the way. So an important distinguishment there. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Brett. And I think that's a really good point to finish off with, the concept that it's not how many properties you own, but it's the size of your asset base. It's how hard the properties work, and owning them in the right structures that you're not spending more on tax than you need to, and that you've got them protected and that you can pass them on to future generations. But being the beginning of a new year, well, we're a little bit into it now, can I make a prediction, please?
Yeah, please.
That most property investors are going to continue to get it wrong. And it's a real pity, because when I started, there wasn't all this information. There weren't Australian books. There wasn't podcasts. There wasn't even tapes on it then. Then the tapes came, and then anyway, so despite all the information, people will still get it wrong because of fear and greed, which is going to continue to drive the market. And if we can taper those emotions by working to a strategy, by not looking for a get-rich-quick scheme, by having a good team of people around you. Because I know part of your job as a property strategist, Brett, is to stop our clients from making mistakes. It's not just to point them in the right direction, it's to stop them from themselves.
Protect them from themselves, Michael. You've often said that to me, yeah.
Definitely. Thanks a lot, Brett.
Thanks for your time.